Hi, this is Phil from Simply Rhino, and today I'd like to take a look at transport rendering in Rhino for Mac and KeyShot for Mac. I've used the example of a high-speed train, as this, compared to, for example, automotive rendering, can be a little more challenging. Most cars have multiple surfaces and forms to catch the light. After all, they're designed this way. The train here, however, is much more mundane, and the long slab sides can be difficult to light in an interesting way. I'm going to take a look at some fairly basic workflows in KeyShot that are essentially of a fairly basic level. So if you're new or fairly new to KeyShot, then you may find this tutorial useful. Let's first of all start in Rhino and take a look at the model we're going to bring into KeyShot. There's a good level of detail on the model, and we've got things such as the recesses for all the grills, we've got the shut lines around the doors and around the windows, we've got the door entry buttons, steps, a correctly modeled wheel set, and all of this is going to help to make our rendering look realistic when we bring this into KeyShot. One of the things we don't have, however, is any of the detail inside of the carriages. So we're going to need to use the convention of black or nearly black reflective glass for the glazing components. I've set up a couple of named views here, and this one is the one that I want to use as a starting point inside of KeyShot. Including the track and the overhead power lines is going to accentuate the sense of perspective in the image, and again I think this is going to help the final image in KeyShot. Now if we were to look at the layers inside of this model, you'll see that each of the major set of components has its own layer, and inside of this the separate layers are split out in terms of color or material finish. Now this is not a bad way to start in Rhino before pushing your geometry into KeyShot, because the default proposition in KeyShot is that materials are applied on a per layer basis, so that any component that sits on an individual layer will have the same material applied to it as other components on that layer. So let's now move the geometry into KeyShot, and I'm going to just type in my KeyShot 7 render command into Rhino and accept that, and this is going to open KeyShot and push the geometry into KeyShot. So you can see that KeyShot is opening now, and we'll just shorten this sequence while the geometry is imported. Okay, so now the geometry has come into KeyShot, and if I go to my cameras on the right here, you can see that I can select render 001, which is the Rhino view, and you'll see we get a pretty similar view to we had in Rhino. Obviously we've got a slightly different aspect ratio here, but essentially we're using the same camera view that we have in Rhino. So I'm just going to adjust this view slightly. I'm going to use the dolly command here to just zoom out a little bit, pan to just pan up a little bit, and tumble to just spin around a little bit here, and just adjust this view slightly. And that's not a bad starting point for where I want to be. I'll maybe just zoom out just slightly from here, and that looks pretty good as a starting point. So I'm going to now save this view, and then I'm going to lock the view so that I don't inadvertently edit it. Now I'm going to switch to the free camera so I can move about in the view if I want to, and now I'm going to take a look at the scene tab inside of here. Now if I open up the model, you will see that I see all the major layers here, and I see all the sub layers. So rather than dragging and dropping materials onto the model itself, I'm going to use the convention of dragging and dropping materials onto the layers. Okay, so before we start adding materials, if we go to the material tab here, you'll see that there are already some materials in the file, And these are essentially the materials that are derived from the layer colors in the Rhino file. And as we add our KeyShot materials, these materials here are going to get eventually replaced and overwritten. So I'm just going to go to make KeyShot full screen here, just so we've got a bit more room to play with. And I'm going to start to apply some materials, and I'm going to look at applying some paint materials initially. Now if we just concentrate on our body side layers here, then you can see that we've got some paint materials here and some metal finishes. So I'll start with the gloss blue, and I'm just going to take the standard gloss blue paint. I'm then going to go to material, and I can either pick the blue gloss paint from down here, or I can go to scene. I can right click on the layer, go to material and edit material. Okay, so this lets us get into the editor for the material. Now KeyShot has simplified material types. So these basic material types here are basically things like plastic, paint, metal, liquid, glass, etc. And the idea of these materials is that the controls are somewhat simplified and preset so that it becomes very easy to build the materials. We also have some advanced materials where we've got more control, and of course we can build materials from scratch should we wish. For the moment we'll concentrate mainly on using the basic materials, and the material type for this color is paint, and there are a couple of things that we can adjust in here. First of all, I want to just change the color of this paint slightly, change the color of the blue, make it a bit more like this, and I'll accept those changes. And if I want to make the paint appear harder, which I just want to make a slight change to here, I can increase slightly the index of refraction. And you'll see the reflection in there just sharpens up slightly when I do that. I also have a roughness slider here. Now the roughness slider basically means that on the left the paint is completely smooth and shiny, and as I move the slider over to the right I get a more satin or rough finish to the paint. Here of course I want something that's completely smooth or shiny, so this slider should be all the way over to the left. Now I'm going to rename this material, and I'm going to call this HST Blue Glass, and I'm then going to go into my materials and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this folder HST, and I'm going to take that material that I've just renamed and drag it into this folder. This will give me a handy folder where all of the materials in this file are going to be located, and because there's obviously a lot of repetitive dragging and dropping of materials that I need to do here, it makes it much easier to have all these materials located in one place. So I'm just going to add the next material now, which is going to be the black. And as I select the layer here, you'll see that the components which carry this material are highlighted in the model. So what we're looking at here is the roof area. For this I want to have a satin black, so I'm going to go to the rough black paint and drag matte black onto here. Then I'm going to edit the material, and I'm going to reduce the amount of roughness of this so it becomes less matte and more satin. I'm not going to increase the refractive index this time. I'm going to rename this HST Black Matte, and I'm going to go to the HST folder and I'm going to drag this material into that folder. I'm now going to repeat this process for not only all of the layers on the body side, but also all of the subsequent layers as well. And so we'll skip to the end of that process. So now we have all the materials applied, and you'll see that my HST folder on the left now is now fully populated with materials. Now, before we go into adjust any of the lighting, I just want to go into the materials down here and change this to a list, and you'll see that because I've applied some of these materials progressively, we've got duplicates in the list here. So I want to make sure that these materials are linked together, so I'll select the 4 materials here that all have a HST black matte reference, right click on them, and I'll link the materials. And I want to make sure that I don't have the numerical prefix after that number. So I'll do the same with the chrome here, link the materials, and do the same with the metallic silver and link the materials, and this one here I need to edit and remove the numerical prefix from it. Okay, now the reason I want to do this is so that these materials that are stored in the library relate to these materials over here. Okay, so now we've got our materials in order, let's now look at the environment and the lighting. So let me first of all go to lighting, and I'm going to change my lighting preset mode from the basic mode to the product mode. Product mode will give me a nicer result because it will calculate some indirect bounces of illumination, and this is going to help with a bit of detail into these areas down here, and also help with the translucent and transparent materials. So we can tweak this possibly later on, or we can use some different presets, but for now I'm just going to set the product mode. I'm then going to go over to the left and I'm going to go to environments. Now at the moment we just have a grayscale startup environment, and I really need something with some contrast to it in this, so I'm going to choose panels from Studio, and I'm going to use the overhead array 4K as a starting point here. Now immediately you'll see that this sharpens up the image. We get some nice sharp reflections going on in the screen here, and we get something happening along the side of the carriage body here. Now this also shows me that some of these materials here are not quite right. So the glass is basically slightly too opaque, and this material on the top of the carriage, the black, possibly also the silver grey color here, are too rough. So I'm going to just quickly go to camera, and I'm going to switch to the free camera, and I'm just going to pan here and zoom in a little bit and just take a little look at this material here, which is black matte, and I'm going to reduce the roughness of that, and you should see that as I do that these reflections start to appear, but in a very blurry way, which is what I want, because I want to simulate a satin finish on that material. So that looks a little better. Now this material will be okay as it is, but if it were closer to the camera, then we might find that the material was a little bit noisy, and here we can go into the roughness and we could increase the number of samples. You would probably never need to do this on a reflective material because the light calculation is pretty straightforward here. The light hits the reflective surface and bounces off in a fairly uniform way. Where we have a matte or a satin finish or a rough finish, then of course the light hits the surface and bounces off in a number of different directions, and that's why we might need to create more samples of light to reduce the noise. let's go back to the camera and restore render 001, and you can see now that little bit of reflection in there now is starting to look much nicer. Now let's go into the environment itself now and edit this a little bit. One of the things that I can do here is that I can flatten the ground, and this is going to help to make this reflection from the ground more consistent. And I can do basic things with the HDR, like turn up and down the brightness and the contrast, and I can of course rotate the HDR to just tweak these reflections that I can see predominantly on the screen. Now if I wanted to reduce the effect of the brightness that I'm getting from the floor here, I can go into the HDR editor and turn on the various pins that I see here for the various parts, and there will be a couple of pins on the floor here that I can disable, and I can effectively reduce the amount of lighting that's coming in off the floor. So I don't want to do this completely, just want to reduce it slightly. And then I'll go back to settings and I'll turn up the general brightness now. I think this is the one that I want to turn off. Okay, you'll see that now reduces the effect of the floor here. Now that means that this highlight now is less aggressive along the edge of the image, but we of course might suffer from a lack of illumination into the wheel set, and particularly if I decide to change my mind on the undercarriage here and have that being a matte black, we might be a little too dark underneath here. So we're going to look at a way that we can actually control this more directly with some geometry that comes from Rhino. But before I do that, I'm just going to go back to settings here, and I'm going to change the background from being the lighting environment to a color. Now if I use a flat white here, that's going to be a little bit too aggressive for my visual here, and it's going to sort of have the effect of flattening off this body side. So I'm going to just make this sort of a darkish grey just for the moment, and then we might look into changing this later on. So overall now the image is starting to look a little more lively, but there's still a lack of interest on this body side. And with the overhead array of panels that we have with the general lighting, we're not really going to see that much going on along this side. This is where we can actually create something in Rhino that's going to help us. Okay, so we're back in Rhino now, and I created an arc and a line, and I extruded these, and the idea is to create a couple of panels that we can use to bounce some light onto the side of the train. This lower panel is curved, and the idea of this is this will hopefully let the light diminish, so it should light up the wheel set and the undercarriage, and then as the curvature moves away from the train, that light should gradually fade. This panel, the top panel here, the idea of this one is this is going to give us a harder reflection across the area where the windows are. Now these panels I've put on separate layers inside of Rhino, and the idea of these is that we can use these as light objects inside of KeyShot. So I'm just going to check that I've got everything on the correct layers here. So if I just turn off panel 1, so panel 1 is the top one, panel 2 is the lower one, and I'm going to run my KeyShot 7 render command, and this should push the geometry to KeyShot. Okay, so we're back inside of KeyShot, and you can see that the two panels that I modeled in Rhino have been inserted into the model. and if I go to the scene, I'll see the two layers here, and I can turn off the visibility of these panels on a per layer basis. So now I'm going to pick panel 1, I'm going to go to materials and lights and area lights, and I'm going to apply an area light to panel 1, and I'm going to apply an area light to panel 2. Then I'm going to go to panel 1 and I'm going to hide that panel just for now. I'm going to go to panel 2 and I'm going to edit the material for that panel. Okay, so this is a light material and the brightness of this is preset to 1200 lumens. Now, because this scene is already very bright, we're not going to see much evidence of this light in the scene, and so I'm going to brighten this up in a moment. The other thing I can do with light objects is I can make them invisible to the camera. So I'm going to add a couple of zeros to the lumens here, and we'll see the light increase. If I make the light visible here, you'll see that the light here can be applied on a per side of the material basis. I don't at the moment know which side is the front and the back, so just by unchecking these I'll find out. So the back is actually facing inwards, so I don't want any light coming out of the back of this panel. I just want to push the light forwards onto the train. So now I've found out which direction is which, I can now uncheck the visibility, and I can then just play with the slider here to increase or decrease the amount of illumination. Now the lights are going to be slightly noisy, and so we may need to increase the samples for our final render, and probably we'd want to push these samples up to something like 64 to clean a little bit of the noise out of the light. And I can see the effect of this light simply by turning it off on the layer, and you can see I can make this reasonably subtle, just adding in a little bit of illumination into that underside. This is going to be particularly useful if, as we've said earlier on, that on the undercarriage, for example, I wanted to employ a matte black material for this part here. We'd see that without that light, things are getting a little dark in there, and we can add that light and just kind of get a little bit more illumination going on along that bottom edge. If we go to the top panel, again I'm going to go into the material for this panel, and I'm going to increase the brightness of this as previous, and uncheck the visibility, and you can see that this now gives me a nice sharp reflection along this edge, which I can make slightly more subtle by moving the slider down, or increase by turning that slider up. So we can just create a little more interest in this body side by using these panels. Okay, now one thing I said I was going to do earlier on and that I neglected to do was to take this glass material here and make this less dark so that we could actually see through the glass by a small amount. So I'll go to my materials over here and go to glass black and go to the color in here and lighten this up, and I just want to give this material a little more transparency, and how much I give this will be really dependent on the background. The lighter the background is, probably the less transparent I want to make this material. So now we've added these light panels, we've now got a little bit more interest along these edges. I need of course to go into panel 1 here and increase the samples in that light to get rid of the noise, and we'll just let this render just progress just to see how it looks, and we'll go back to the environment and maybe just make some minor tweaks to the environment and perhaps have a look at this with a white background now, which was our starting proposition. Now if we want to increase the brightness of the image without increasing the brightness of just the lighting, then I can go to my image over here and I can turn up the brightness of the whole image. You can also see now that this material here, which is the aluminium, is actually very rough. So again, I'm going to go to my materials here and edit the aluminium material here and just reduce the amount of roughness. And again, if we're getting noise in here, we can increase the samples. Okay, so we've now got a good basic studio scene that I can render out. I've created a couple of different camera views now, but before I do the renders, I'm going to turn off the ground shadows because I don't want this element along here, the ballast, I don't want that casting any shadows onto the white background. This isn't going to affect any of the shadows that the geometry elements are creating. This just affects the shadow onto the notional ground plane. So I'm going to render this out and I'm going to choose either a Photoshop or a TIFF format, and I'll choose Photoshop and I'll check the include alpha transparency setting. This is going to allow the white background to become transparent, and this is going to give me the option of doing a little bit of post-processing to the image afterwards. I'm rendering this out at 2500 pixels wide, and I'll hit the render button and we'll skip to the end of the render. Okay, so the render's completed now, and we'll just run out another render pass, and this time I want to just exclude the immediate context, so I just want to actually render out the train itself. And the reason I want to do this is I want a separate alpha channel for the train. So there are a number of different ways of achieving this, but if you just wanted to render out this quickly just to provide an alpha channel, then of course I don't really need to calculate all these complex materials. So I'll just go down here and I'll turn off the light panels, and I'll just drag a basic black material right onto the top layer of my model and go into the material for this and just simplify this even further. So this will render out quickly and give me an alpha channel. So I'll render out this again. And create the render for the alpha channel. Okay, and that's that render completed. Now it's important, if you use this method of replacing the materials, that you do this on a copy of the file, or make sure that you've got enough memory to basically undo the changes that you made to the materials. Saving the file is obviously an awful lot safer than relying on undos to do this for you. Okay, so I'm just going to revert this to its previous stage, and let's take a look at these renders in Photoshop. So this is the render pretty much as it came out of KeyShot. This has just had some minor adjustments in Photoshop, and this is a good example of a basic render that we could use to present a design concept. This is the second view that I rendered out, and again you can see that this is a fairly straightforward visual. We get a good appreciation of the shape and the form, and the additional panels that we put down the side of the carriage body help to give us something to exaggerate the perspective. Now if we wanted to do something a little more interesting with these images, maybe for a feature image, then the fact that I rendered out this additional channel in KeyShot is going to be helpful for us. So let's now go into Photoshop and take a look at how we can compose an image and give it some added interest. So here we have the two images that I rendered out from KeyShot. I'm just using the basic version of Photoshop Elements, and this doesn't have the ability to have channels in the layer palette. So the idea of using this simplified material for this selection is much more relevant if you only have a basic image editor. So the idea of the image that I want to create is that I want to have the train having the appearance of some motion, and the track and the overhead cables of course being stationary. So I'm going to do this via a composite image, and I'm first of all going to rename the first layer. I'm going to call this sharp. Then I'm going to duplicate the layer, and I'm going to call this motion blur. And I want the motion blur layer to be above the sharp layer, and then I'm going to create a new layer, and I want to call this background, and I want to drop this at the bottom of the layer stack. Now it can help you see the changes on the image if you give the base layer a fill, just a white. You can always turn this off to see the transparency in the image. And now I'm going to go to my second image. So what I want to do first of all is just to create a little area here and fill this, and a little area in this corner and fill this. Okay, the reason I want to do this is so I can register the two images together. If I don't do this, then Photoshop, because this has got a transparent background, will not necessarily register the two images together. I'm going to select everything and then copy to the clipboard and then paste this into my composite image and push this up to the top of the layer stack and turn off the other layers. Okay, now I'm going to use this purely as a means to an end as a selection. Then I can make the motion blur layer active and hide my layer 1, and you'll now see I have the train selected. So if I now select the inverse of this and delete, I'll just have the train on its own selected. So now I want to apply some motion blur to this motion blur layer. Filter, blur, and motion blur, and we can make this quite exaggerated, and we can just change the angle of the motion blur so that this is just slightly following the perspective direction here, and I'll OK that. Then I want to turn on the layers underneath, And now I'm going to apply a layer mask to the motion blur layer. Then inside that layer mask I'm going to use a black and white gradient, again following the direction of the train, and you'll see that the gradient basically masks the image, so I see the blurred image through on the right hand side here, and gradually we'll lose that image as the gradient becomes white. And I can just vary this strength of this by how far I pull the gradient over. So that's starting to give me something now that where the front of this is reasonably sharp, but I've got the impression that this is actually moving. So now I can apply the layer mask, and you'll see now that's what it's doing here. It's just fading away the front of that image. And now I can look at doing something to the background. Again, I might use a black and white gradient here, and like this, maybe just get this slightly differently. Okay, that looks good. And then this portion here I can just basically select and probably fill this with black. So I'll just use a polygon lasso to just pick this area, and I'll fill this with black. Okay, and now this is starting to look a bit more dramatic. So I can just now flatten the layers, do a bit of adjustment to the brightness and contrast, sharpen this up, and we'll have an image that's a little more suitable for a feature image. So this might be the one that we use to introduce the concept before showing the more straightforward views of the train. So here's that image that we just put together, and you can see this is just a little bit more interesting perhaps than the straightforward studio renders. So finally for this video, let's go back into KeyShot and just look at a slightly different way of producing the studio visual. First of all, I'm just going to go back and I'm going to turn off the lights that I created, and I'm going to go into the environment, and I'm going to set these values back to their defaults. So rather than using a studio HDR now, I'm going to take a look at using a more literal image. So I'll go to the environments on the left here and outdoor environments, and let's load up this one here, for example, which is one of the standard environments, and let's just give this a bit of rotation, and here we go, and just change the height of this slightly. Gives me quite a nice highlight around here, and also this little bit of interest down the side of the carriage as well. And I'm going to increase the brightness of this slightly. And remember that if you use an image like this, this one perhaps is not too extreme in this respect, but sometimes we can heavily colorize our image by the color of the lighting environment. So in that case, we can go to the HDR editor and we can reduce the saturation of the image and make this image more grayscale. Okay, so you can see the preview up here. So this is heavily saturated, this is less heavily saturated. Okay, so make this much more neutral. Now remember that when you make the adjustments to the HDR, we're going to need to generate the full resolution HDR so we can see these proper reflections in here. Okay, so the only thing I'm not particularly liking here are these reflections. So I'm going to just go back to settings, just see if I can just move these a little bit. If I move them all the way down here, maybe that's a little better. Still see this nice reflection here, although what's reflected in here isn't as good. So maybe if I line them up with the door as a compromise. Let's go into the image, just increase the brightness of the image slightly. Now you'll notice that this area along here is pretty dark, again because of the fact that most of the light is coming from above, and this kind of area is sort of hidden slightly underneath the carriage. So if I go back to my scene and I just turn on the lower of the two lights here, and let me just toggle these on and off, you can see the difference that makes just in adding a bit of illumination to this underside. Doesn't necessarily contradict anything else that we've got going on with the illumination, but just helps this underside here. So I'm just going to go to the material for that panel and just reduce the brightness of that slightly. So I'm just going to make a few tweaks to the image now, and then I'll render it out and we'll take a look at the final image. Here's the image rendered from KeyShot, and you can see that using an exterior HDR lighting environment with some additional local lighting is a viable way to create a fairly straightforward studio render. That's about all I wanted to cover in this video, and you can hopefully see that creating photorealistic images from your Rhino for Mac models is pretty easy using KeyShot. Please feel free to leave any comments below, and if you found this video useful, please hit the like button. To keep up with the latest news on Rhino for Mac and KeyShot, please subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch up with you again in the next video.